Hello and welcome to Timmy Mac Politics with me, Mr. McClellan. We are going to focus on the question as to whether pressure groups are good for democracy and effective government. This question doesn't appear too frequently on the A-level politics exam, but when it does, I think students struggle with it just a little bit more than they do with the classic question, the more frequent question on pressure group effectiveness. So do bear that in mind. I don't think this is a question which you can wing too well without having done some deliberate preparation for it. If you do the preparation, you'll have no trouble with it, I'm sure. But having said that, make sure you watch the effectiveness video which I've done on pressure groups, because it does kind of inform you much better in relation to all of this content as well. As a starting point, guys, well, it's good to start with a definition, of course. And indeed, the definition of a pressure group, you should know this from looking at your video, or my video rather, on pressure group effectiveness. A pressure group can be defined as a group of like-minded individuals that seek to achieve change or maintain the status quo by influencing decision makers, most particularly the government. They don't seek elected office themselves, because if they did, they would be a political party. So that's what differentiates the two between a pressure group and a political party. So get that definition in there. It's also worth stating in your introduction, Wynne-Grant typology on pressure groups. So that's your classic insider, outsider, sectional cause typology, and it's worth giving a little bit of a nod to the limitations of Wynne-Grant's typology insofar as it doesn't necessarily state the subcategories that exist for pressure groups. So for example, your core insiders, your peripheral insiders, or indeed it doesn't necessarily highlight the flux that exists in the pressure group landscape, whereby pressure groups can straddle several of those insider-outsider sectional cause categories, or indeed move from one to the other. So just a quick reference to the limitations of Wynne-Grant's typology will get you a few brownie points. More brownie points, though, I feel will be awarded if indeed you talk about the type of democracy that we have in the UK, because that's going to put the rest of your answer into context. And I think it's fair to say that we have a parliamentary representative democracy in the UK. And it's important, that contextual awareness, simply because we're not talking about the context of many other democracies that exist in the world. Let's take America as an example. So America has a congressional, federal, presidential democracy, you could sum that up as. And indeed, in contrast, you've got Russia, which has a more managed democracy, shall we say, a democracy in name only. So democracies come in many different forms, and therefore be more specific about the democracy that exists in the UK, a representative parliamentary democracy. So that's your introduction over and done with. And then you can see the way in which I structured all the content in here. And what I've tried to do by looking at reasons why pressure groups enhance democracy and effective government, and then reasons why they undermine it, then go back to reasons why they enhance democracy and effective government, and then finishing with another section on why they undermine democracy and effective government, is by having that to and fro of argument. And I like to see this in essays as opposed to the more formulaic arguments in favour, arguments against, or arguments for one side and arguments on the other side. I think intellectual debate is much more stimulating because of the to and the fro of it. And I've tried to reflect that in this answer, or indeed the structure of this content, rather than the more simplistic one side versus the other side. I don't think we have intellectual argument in that way, so I've reflected that in this answer, if you like. So, in terms of the first section, reasons why pressure groups enhance democracy and effective government, well, pressure groups encourage political participation. They allow people to get directly involved in politics in between elections. You don't have to wait once every 5 years to join a pressure group, as opposed to voting in a general election. You can join a pressure group pretty much at any time. So they allow people to participate in between elections, they educate people, and they raise awareness in relation to certain issues. And I've given the example of a really kind of classic pressure group in the Royal British Legion, okay? It's kind of steeped in British society, and the pressure group landscape existed for many years. And of course, the Royal British Legion are responsible for the annual Poppy Appeal, which happens around about November time every single year. And by doing the Poppy Appeal, they raise awareness of the issues which affect soldiers and indeed ex-soldiers, veterans, bringing those issues to the fore in terms of their aftercare and indeed the amount of pay perhaps that soldiers will receive in the army, the way that they are looked after in terms of the military covenant which exists between the armed forces of this country and indeed the British government, and is that covenant being respected. So there's a level of accountability which the Royal British Legion can hold the government to simply because they're so influential, even to the extent that they're able to raise around about £50 million annually as a result of their poppy appeal. So certainly they do raise awareness of the issues which are affecting soldiers and ex-soldiers. Moving on, pressure groups do allow citizens to have a voice. That's why they enhance democracy. They give a voice to the voiceless. And I've used two examples here, quite different examples, but we've got the Stonewall pressure group, which represents the minority interests of the gay community, and indeed Help the Aged, which has a huge demographic which it can represent, in the sense that over 12 million people in the UK around about the time of 2020 are 65 years old and older. And therefore, many of these people will be considered to be vulnerable, who Help the Aged can represent. Many elderly people, of course, reside in care homes, and therefore they may not feel that they have much of a voice, that no one's really listening to them, and therefore Help the Aged will supply them with that voice by representing their interests. When it comes to Stonewall representing the interests of the gay community, well, it's probably useful for me to point out that the name comes from the Stonewall pub, or the Stonewall Inn as it was called, situated in New York, and it kind of gained prominence, that particular venue, simply because it was raided by the police in 1969, and from that police raid the gay community felt particularly discriminated against, and it seemed that it led to a series of riots which were dubbed the Stonewall riots in the late 1960s, where the frustrations of the gay community as a result of allegedly, and I think, generally being discriminated against by the government and by the law as well. So it came to the fore in the form of those Stonewall riots, and that's where the name Stonewall comes from. But they do represent the interests of the gay community, gay rights, for the gay community to be free from discrimination, giving a voice to that voiceless minority, arguably voiceless minority, but certainly strengthen the voice of the gay community. Equally, pressure groups do have the ability to focus on a single issue, bringing it to the fore. And I've given the example here of the Snowdrop campaign, that by focusing on a single issue really compelled the government to act. Now, the Snowdrop campaign stemmed from the tragic events which occurred at the primary school of Dunblane up in Scotland in 1996, whereby a gunman named Thomas Hamilton went into the primary school and killed a number of children and indeed their teacher. Now, as a result of the Snowdrop campaign, handguns were banned by the UK government. So you can see that that campaign had an awful lot of success by focusing on that issue, which wouldn't necessarily be an election campaign issue. And therefore you can see the value of the Snowdrop campaign by honing in on that particular issue of gun ownership to achieve, I think, what many people consider to be positive change. And then finally, guys, you also get a better informed government as a result of the work of pressure groups. And I've given the example here of the National Farmers Union, the NFU, which will, in post-Brexit Britain, be hugely concerned with the welfare of farmers and the farming industry more general. You know, where is farming subsidy going to come from? British farmers would benefit an awful lot as a result of EU subsidies, which aren't going to apply to them in the long term when we untangle ourselves from the European Union. So the National Farmers Union will be involved in that very complicated issue. And indeed, to help the National Farmers Union become better informed, they're actually a member of this group known as COPPA, the Committee of Professional Agricultural Organisations. So COPPA is an EU-based group. It's an amalgamation of groups like the National Farmers Union from other EU countries. So if you manage to coordinate the interests of European farmers, you'll be able to better solve certain issues in relation to farm subsidy, which will relate to the EU's policy of the Common Agricultural Policy. It's through the Common Agricultural Policy that farm subsidies to farmers is distributed. So therefore that's going to affect UK farmers an awful lot, and the fact that they're no longer going to be subject to the Common Agricultural Policy. So it's the work of the National Farmers Union which will be at the forefront of farm subsidies going to UK farmers, and they'll get an awful lot of information of that Euro group, copper, and that's why I really wanted to include them in my examples. They are an example of a Euro group. They transgress borders, if you like. So get that phrase in there, that the NFU do work alongside the Euro group, copper, to help the government be better informed on complicated issues. And all of that together, you can therefore cite the argument that pressure groups enhance democracy because they are the embodiment of pluralism. Pluralism, that so-called level playing field that exists, that allows pressure groups to put forward their competing voices in order to achieve the change that they want, in the hope that government will listen to them. So we do live in a pluralistic society, and pressure groups are at the heart of that pluralistic society by putting forward different competing arguments which the government can listen to them. So pressure groups, so the argument would hold, are an integral part of the pluralistic nature of British society. Now, in contrast to those reasons for pressure group enhancing democracy, we have the arguments in favour of pressure groups undermining democracy. So the opposite, if you like. Well, we focused on political participation. There's a reason why pressure groups enhance democracy, but you could argue that the political participation that pressure groups encourage is a slacktivist participation culture, that so-called checkbook membership where some people are just joining a pressure group as a way to get involved in politics, and yet they're not really doing too much other than getting the benefits of pressure group membership simply by giving over money. So that is a cynic's view of pressure group participation, the slacktivist participation which they encourage. Having said that, pressure groups do encourage direct action, or at least some pressure groups encourage direct action, and that can lead to civil disobedience, deliberate acts of law-breaking even. Now, I've given the example of SHAC, which stands for Stop Huntingdon Animal Cruelty. Stop Huntingdon Animal Cruelty. So this pressure group, in terms of the methodology which they employed, actually threatened the rule of law. They indeed broke the law in order to get awareness of the point that they were trying to make and to hold certain decision makers to account. So let me explain the context of this to you. Huntingdon Life Sciences is an animal testing laboratory which was situated just outside Cambridge. Now, SHAC, the group, obviously were vehemently opposed against animal testing, and rather more controversially, they decided to employ very extreme pressure group tactics in order to put their point across, to the extent that some members were convicted of criminal offences in relation to intimidation of certain people who were involved in Huntingdon Life Sciences. So this pressure group really did employ rather extreme pressure group tactics in order to make their point, in order to raise awareness and to try and force decision makers to act on their behalf, and indeed, as they would argue, on behalf of animal welfare. But it was such a level of civil disobedience that it arguably alienated many people away from, the arguably credible aims which they were trying to achieve, and with it they were undermining democracy. I don't think you can really have an argument that holds too much weight if you have a pressure group which is deliberately breaking the law and then try and say that they enhance democracy. Okay, law breaking and democracy don't necessarily go hand in hand too well. Following on from that, you could also argue that pressure groups, because they're so focused on their particular aims, they have a narrow focus which stops joined up government. And I've given the example here of the Feed Me Better campaign, which originated from Jamie Oliver's the famous chef, of course, 2005 school dinners campaign. So, Jamie Oliver, I'm sure you'll all know who he is, but in 2005, you know, when he was a little bit more fresh-faced, if you like, he was engaged in trying to improve the quality of school dinners within schools, of course. Now, Jamie Oliver argued that not enough investment was going into school meals, and indeed there was a shortfall in the level of training for some of the kitchen staff, and indeed the produce, the quality of the produce which they were serving to students in the UK, which really didn't help the quality of learning which they were able to engage in. So Jamie Oliver cited this particular issue, he raised awareness of it, and from his Channel 4 series, which accompanied his campaign, came the Feed Me Better campaign. And Jamie Oliver, he achieved a lot of success with this, and more money was put into school dinners, and indeed the quality did improve. But I do remember that some kitchen staff and indeed some schools were complaining that they didn't really have the kitchen facilities nor the training necessarily to deliver the school meals that Jamie Oliver wanted. So it's all very well the government improving school dinners, that's very good of course on the face of it, but having said that, you need joined up government to train people, to have the equipment, to have the space to deliver these better school meals. And pressure groups, if they do achieve change, then it doesn't necessarily come from joined up government, and that tends to come a little bit later. Equally, guys, some groups, and I'm going to chuck out a quotation which I think would be really useful for you to cite. Some groups, it's argued, are more equal than others. That Orwellian George Orwell quotation, whereby it's referencing that some pressure groups are not necessarily equal, they're more powerful with each other, or indeed when compared with each other. So to say that it's a level playing field for pressure groups is overly simplistic. According to that quotation, some pressure groups are more powerful because they have more resources, they've got more money, more expertise, and the example being the Confederation of British Industry, the CBI. Now, the CBI represents small business all the way up to large business. It's well funded with many members, and the government do often listen to the points of view of the CBI. And rather interestingly, during the 2014 Scottish Independence campaign, and I've referenced that here by calling it the IndieRef, that abbreviation, but during the 2014 Scottish Independence campaign, the CBI publicly stated their position against Scottish independence. They obviously argued that it would harm UK business, in particular Scottish business. Now, that pressure group, because it is relatively powerful, people tend to listen to the CPI. You could argue it was skewing the debate, the political debate, in favour of the No campaign for Scottish independence. People like Nicola Sturgeon fell out with the CBI in relation to their public position, and indeed they are so powerful that arguably they're able to influence the minds of ordinary Scottish voters. And some people argue that that public announcement of their position in relation to Scottish independence was simply uncalled for. It wasn't necessary. The CBI shouldn't really be getting involved so publicly in such matters. So the power of that group allowed their voice to be heard more so than other groups, perhaps. And then finally, guys, and it does link in with that example of the CBI, the information that pressure groups do give to the government is skewed. Pressure groups, of course, they're biased in favour of their own particular aims or causes. They are self-serving. They're a self-serving elite, and therefore that chimes with the elite theory of pressure group activity. They're there simply to represent themselves and the interests of their members, and they can skew political decision making because of their self-serving nature. Doesn't really enhance democracy, it undermines it because it undermines effective decision making by the government. So there's an enhancement section, there's an undermining section, and now we go back to deliver a counter argument in terms of enhancing pressure groups, enhancing democracy and efficient government. So all that said, pressure groups, some of them are so large that they can be said to be representative. They have representative memberships, and I've given the example of the National Union of Students, which has a huge membership of 7 million members. Some people, of course, have argued that pressure groups only represent narrow interests Well, that argument is weakened somewhat when you consider the NUS represents 7 million students. So it makes their points of view more legitimate because they've got such a big membership. They're going to represent the interests not just of students, but black students, gay students, rich students, poor students, and therefore they can speak on behalf of a whole demographic within the UK. So, obviously, that enhances democracy when you get a pressure group representing so many different types of people, although they have the commonality of being students. Now, I'm going to stick on the NUS as an example here because they're a pressure group that is a good example, a useful example of being internally democratic. Okay, some pressure groups, it's argued, aren't necessarily democratic, they're authoritarian and therefore they lack legitimacy, but many pressure groups, they've got democratic systems in terms of their organisation, which increases the legitimacy of that pressure group, just like the democratic nature of this country increases the legitimacy of the national government, of course. So the NUS is a good example of this because they elect a president once every 2 years. And indeed, the electoral campaigns for the NUS president is very vigorous, it's hotly contested, and therefore they're a good example of a pressure group being internally democratic, more so perhaps than other pressure groups, and I'll get onto an example in just a second. In contrast then, guys, we're going back to Undermine, that toing and froing of argument here. Pressure groups, some of them have a disproportionate amount of influence. And I've given the example here of the pressure group Transaction, which in 2000 was a part of the fuel protest, which kind of swept through the nation in the midst of the Tony Blair Labour government. Now, if you're around at the time of the 2000 fuel protest, you will not forget it, because to all intents and purposes, this country pretty much ground to a halt. You had groups like Transaction, which represented road haulage companies, truckers in other words, lorry drivers, who were so fed up with the price of fuel at the pump, which if you didn't know is largely based on taxation. The government gets an awful lot of public revenue because of the price of fuel at petrol stations, which of course costs road haulage companies an awful lot of money, and they argued they were struggling to compete with their European rivals. So what a group of them decided to do, including Transaction, was to blockade the oil refineries at places like Stanlow in Cheshire, which the oil is imported into, and indeed places like Grangemouth up in Scotland as well. So they used their lorries to blockade these refineries so that no oil could leave and therefore be delivered to the pumps. And in simple terms, the country started to run out of fuel. People were struggling to fuel their cars. There were big queues around the block, if you like, outside petrol stations. People were so desperate for fuel, and it represented a national crisis simply because many key workers, such as doctors, as an example, couldn't get to work, and it was felt that lives were at risk. So it was Transaction, which was a group which was at the forefront of that particular campaign, but you could argue that they only represented a relatively small amount of people, if you like. They had a disproportionate influence simply because of the nature of the direct action which they decided to undertake by blockading these refineries. Hardly democratic, hardly a legitimate pressure group tactic, if you like, and therefore you could use that as an example of pressure groups undermining democracy and effective government. And indeed, since the fuel protests of 2000, I think chancellors of the Exchequer are very hesitant, very nervous when it comes to increasing the amount of fuel duty when it comes to filling up your car. So is that the best way to try and influence a government? Arguably not. As I've said, the government gets a lot of tax revenue from the price of fuel, but they're hesitant to get more revenue from fuel simply because of the actions of the fuel protesters in 2000. I think that particular protest lives long in the memory of many chancellors of the Exchequer, even to this day. Equally, guys, many pressure groups are not representative of the wider population. Links in with, of course, with Transaction. Indeed, when it comes to transaction, I'm sure many members of the public had sympathy with what they were suggesting. The price of fuel was very high, but would they have gone to those lengths to actually make their point? And I think many members of the public were rather worried in the end as to what the fuel protesters were doing. Anyway, linking on to the next example, we've got Margaret Thatcher's statement that pressure groups represented the enemy within this country. Now that quote, which is attributed to Margaret Thatcher, was apparently delivered by her in a private meeting with Conservative Party politicians. She apparently didn't say it publicly, nevertheless it has been attributed to her, and she was citing the argument that the enemy within was the trade union movement, and more specifically the National Union of Mine Workers in the midst of the miners' strike of 1984 and 1985. A very bitter dispute which lives long in the memories from those people who were there at the time. And indeed, Margaret Thatcher felt that the National Mine Workers Union was effectively holding this country to ransom as a result of their demands, and she wasn't prepared to stand for it, and she did pretty much employ a tactic of trying to break the union, to break the strike of mine workers in order to effectively deliver upon her what she considered her elected mandate. Okay, she, as the government or a representative of the government, represented the wider population because she had been voted for and her government had been voted for, unlike necessarily the National Union of Mine Workers, and indeed their hierarchy had probably just been voted on by the members, not the wider population. Okay, so Margaret Thatcher dubbed them the enemy within. And equally, guys, some pressure groups aren't necessarily internally democratic, okay? And I'm going to bring back Wyn Grant here. Wyn Grant, by the way, is a professor of politics at the University of Warwick, and he did some research on Greenpeace and argued that Greenpeace were not necessarily an internally democratic institution. They were more perhaps authoritarian in the way in which they conducted themselves in terms of internal organisation. And because of that, you could argue that groups lack legitimacy when they are not internally democratic, as perhaps other groups, and I've given you the example of the National Union of Students. And therefore, if these groups are influential, they're trying to influence the democratic process, but not by being internally democratic themselves, then that really leads to their arguments losing a little bit of legitimacy. And then by way of a conclusion, guys, once you've done the toing and froing of argument, the best way to construct an essay, I would argue, a little bit more difficult, but I'm sure you can manage it, is come to your conclusion. And really, I think there's a grain of truth in both positions when it comes to pressure groups enhancing and indeed undermining democracy. So I'm going to begin with a quote here, a rather famous quote, which is attributed to the Foreign Secretary Douglas Hurd. He was Foreign Secretary at the time of the Margaret Thatcher government in the 1980s, and he actually argued that pressure groups are serpents, or were serpents, that strangle efficient government, okay? Now, you've got to put this quotation, just like all quotations, into context. Douglas Hurd, as a member of the Thatcher government, was part of the New Right conservative movement, this kind of rise of conservatism which aligned itself with Margaret Thatcher's premiership and indeed the presidency of Ronald Reagan over in the States. They were dubbed the New Right, and really this kind of focus on economics, this drive to promote economic growth in countries was dubbed the New Right, and really it's this kind of impatience to reform countries very quickly. They're short, sharp shock in order to get these countries such as Britain and indeed the United States moving economically speaking. So Douglas Hurd, and I think it's fair to say Margaret Thatcher, were no fans of the pressure group movement or indeed the influence that some pressure groups, particularly the trade unions, had at the time of the 1980s. So we came out of that infamous quote that pressure groups are serpents, snake-like serpents that strangle efficient government. Leading on from that, you could argue that pressure groups represent the tyranny of the minority over the majority, that kind of classic quotation, the tyranny of the minority over the majority, whereby pressure groups represent the interests of minority groups to the detriment of everyone else, the majority. And I think there are some examples which you can cite in relation to that. And equally, Margaret Thatcher and indeed many prime ministers since would argue that pressure groups can get in the way of their electoral mandate. Pressure groups, of course, only have a mandate specifically from their members. Political parties and indeed governments have their mandate from the voting age population, okay, which runs, of course, into the many, many, many millions. Pressure groups don't have the same mandate, so you can criticise them in relation to their activities and the fact that they may undermine democracy because they're not necessarily representative as much as the government per se. In contrast to that, guys, of course, pressure groups create a participatory democracy, okay? They're absolutely pivotal to that. It links in with this idea of pluralism, of course, that pressure groups allow people to take part in politics, and they're fundamental to that. So I think it's worth re-emphasising that point in your conclusion. They are a check on government power, and they allow the dispossessed to fight back, okay? They give a voice to the downtrodden, those people who feel marginalised in society, and you can link that with Marxist theory. The proletariat, as Marx would have it, rising up to try and take on the elite which C. Wright Mills cited as being those people who have tried to rig society in their favour. And really, Marxist theory, of course, contrasts with C. Wright Mills's point of view that actually people like pressure groups or people involved in pressure groups are really self-serving individuals. So in your conclusion, bring in the pluralistic versus elite theory, the elite theory advocated by the American sociologist C. Wright Mills as a result of his 1956 book, The Power Elite. Okay, so some really useful points, Marxist theory, C. Wright Mills, elite theory, to get in there as your conclusion. Hope that's all useful to you. Thank you very much.